So here we are. Yeah. Here's our tribe now, our new configuration. It's like this now. What are we doing here? We could be home watching Sunday night football, knitting, reading a good book, watching a nice movie, having dinner with our friends. And instead we're doing this really peculiar thing. And it's hard. What on earth are we doing here? And probably just a moment's contemplation will reveal that our intention in being here is really the same as the Buddha's intention was all those years ago. That there's something here that might teach us about suffering and freedom. So as hard as this is, and as challenging, as unpleasant as it is at times, it's like, I think there's something here. I don't know where it is, but, I think there's something here. So what brings us really is stress or suffering, or the Pali word dukkha. I think this came from Pat, actually, this dukkha, the unsatisfactoriness of human life on this planet is disturbance, irritation, dejection, worry, despair, fear, dread, anguish, anxiety, vulnerability, injury, inability, inferiority, sickness, aging, decay of the body and faculties, senility, pain, pleasure, excitement, boredom, deprivation, excess, desire, frustration, suppression, longing, aimlessness, hope, hopelessness, effort, activity, striving, repression, loss, want, insufficiency, satiety, love, lovelessness, friendlessness, dislike, aversion, attraction, parenthood, childlessness, submission, rebellion, decision, indecisiveness, vacillation, uncertainty. That's what brings us here, huh? All that stuff. This stuff of this human life. Ajahn Sumedho says having a human body is just one annoyance after another. We get it, don't we, today? Just one annoyance after another. We're hot, we're cold, we're hungry, we're tired. Our legs hurt, our back aches. We want our meal, it's late. We come because we heard that last year it was just gloriously autumn here and the sun was shining and it was so beautiful and wonderful and it's like this now. We come, just so thrilled that Hugh and Pat are going to be here and what? So all this stuff, all these challenges of our lives, that somehow there's some sense that there's something here that is more healing for us than watching Sunday night football. And so we inquire together, we look to see, well, what, how does this really work? How does this really work? We have a pleasant experience and it leaves us empty. We meet a pleasant person, have a nourishing relationship. We receive and welcome all kinds of goodness, like with Pat and Hugh, and it ends. People leave, people die. relationships end, even these wonderful ones. People change, we change. We have an unpleasant relationship and it hangs around. People ignore us or behave badly or blame us or misunderstand us. They're hostile, they're unkind. They bomb our buildings. Or they simply don't respond to our wishes, like my cat, in the ways that we think they should or might, All this dukkha, all this stuff that happens that isn't really what we would wish, and it's just part of this human life. The Buddha says, and what is the stress of association with the unbeloved? There is the case where undesirable, unpleasing, unattractive sights, sounds, aromas, flavors, or tactile sensations occur to one, or one has connection, contact, relationship, interaction with those who wish one ill, who wish for one's harm, who wish for one's discomfort, who wish one no security from the yoke. This is called the stress, he says, of association with the unbeloved. And what is the stress of separation from the loved? There is the case where desirable, pleasing, attractive sights, sounds, aromas, flavors, or tactile sensations do not occur to one. Or one has no connection, no contact, no relationship, no interaction with those who wish one well, who wish for one's benefit, who wish for one's comfort, who wish for one's security from the yoke, nor with one's mother, father, brother, sister, friends, companions, or relatives. This is called the stress of separation from the loved. Association with the undesirable is suffering. Separation from the desirable is suffering. Not getting what one wants is suffering. Whoever encounters ill wishers, wishers of harm, wishers of discomfort, of insecurity, separation from what is wanted, liked, pleased, pleasant sights, objects, sounds, separation from well-wishers, wishers of good, of comfort, of security. He goes on in so many ways. This is suffering. And the truth of his insight is called the noble truth of dukkha, to really see that this is how it is in this human life. And these moments are opportunities for awakening, for freedom, for seeing past what he calls the illusion of things, for seeing past our confusion. Ajahn Chah would tell us that all of these circumstances are gifts. Don't you hate it when people say that? It's good for you. It builds character. But it really does. It's really true. With wise discernment and kindness, patience and diligence, these can show us where we're caught, and they can point the doorway to freedom. Where it's hard to be fully present in this very life, and how that very presence, simple presence, can lead to freedom. And they can offer an invitation to walk through the doorway, if only because they're so challenging and we don't want to kind of hang around in the doorway all that long. So can't we find some way through this? The Buddha invites us to learn, and we learn slowly for most of us. There are these wonderful stories of sudden awakening. Doesn't seem to be happening to me. But so slowly we learn, for most of us, and over time, to let go and to become a little more present, irrespective of whatever the conditions are of our lives. To simply know experience directly here and now, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, and to learn to see directly how things are, how they're working, and given that, what's needed. See, it's like this now. So it isn't just sort of, it's like this now, and then we sink into it. But it's like this now, and then, oh, that opens a bit of clarity to see, well, what's needed then? There's a story that some of you have probably heard me tell, and I'm going to not apologize for these stories. I was thinking as I was preparing this, it's so lovely to teach in New Zealand where nobody's heard my stories before. I can just sort of tell my stories randomly. So some of you will have heard some of them before, but there's a story that really just amuses me so much. There's a story about a British golf course in Calcutta, and they had trouble with monkeys taking the balls. The monkeys would hop on the golf course and steal all the balls, or move them. They'd play with them, they'd move them. And they tried all kinds of things. They tried building a fence. They tried placing food outside the fence. They tried moving the monkeys. They tried all sorts of things. And still the monkeys came back and thought it was just huge fun to play with the balls on the golf course. And so they had this dukkha, they had this suffering. It's like, what are we going to do here? We don't want to kill these monkeys, and even if we do, there'll just be more monkeys that come in. So, what are we going to do? And so what they ended up doing as they kind of sat with, they had done reasonable things, and they sat with this dilemma. It's like this now. And so what they did was they changed the rules. They said, the new rules in this golf course are you play the ball wherever the monkey puts it. So, new way to play golf. But we want to see the millions of ways that we turn away from our experience, that we have these difficulties, and we see, and one of the things that we see as we sit on our cushions, isn't it, the ways that we really are pretty convinced that the way to be with this is to get away from it. We can hear these teachings, and they, it sort of sounds really good. You hear the teachings about being present and mindfulness and all that, and it really sounds right. And then we reflect on it and we practice it a little bit. And it's sort of the second layer that the Buddha talks about of our practice, where we start to reflect on it, and it still kind of sounds right. It's like, yeah. Where it gets really dicey is in the third layer, that layer of experience, where we really come into the direct experience of dukkha in our bodies, in our minds, and it doesn't sound right at all anymore. We just want to get away from it. We want it to end. We want to turn away. We want to, eat more chocolate. We want to do something that really kind of gets us out of this. And so that's the layer that we work with here, as we're on retreat. This layer of really dropping out of the concept of mindfulness. Don't you love it? There are all these posters. They're like billboards about mindfulness and everything. Everybody's like, yay, mindfulness. Which sounds good until you really you really sit with it and you say, wow, this is really hard work. We turn away by distancing, by criticizing, judging ourselves, our experience, others, trying to fix others, change them, trying to fix ourselves. We turn away in delusion, in boredom, in disinterest, spacing out, daydreaming, eating chocolate. And we turn away in greed, trying to control our own or get more and more of a good thing. More and more chocolate. So how do we get so stuck? I was reading some things about Yogi Berra, and I love his sayings. And one of the sayings that they posted last week was, baseball is 90% mental. The other half is physical. And I thought, well, that's how meditation is, and that's how dukkha is, and that's what we're dealing with. It's 90% mental, although I think the Buddha would say it's actually 100% mental. That our suffering is in our minds. Our suffering is in our minds. And so we come to practice as a way of inquiring into that. Really? Baseball is 90% mental. It sort of surprised me. You'd think, you just sort of get out there and you kind of catch a few balls. 90% mental, he said. Meditation is 100% mental. In our modern neuropsychology, there are lots of ways, lots of research studies that are really supporting the Buddha. There really hasn't been anything in particular that contradicts what the Buddha taught 2,600 years ago, which is actually pretty amazing, pretty remarkable. Although the Dalai Lama has said, if that were the case, then we should change Buddhism, So he says he's perfectly open to neuroscience. But neuroscience, Rick Hansen has a lovely way often of kind of simplifying some of the modern research. And he talks about three qualities of the mind that kind of get us in trouble a little bit. But they're just normal qualities of the mind. Evolution has given us these qualities. And they're both useful, kind of in the way that our file folders are useful. They kind of keep things in order, but they're not exactly true, so that they get us in trouble. And he said one of the things that our mind has done over the years is, as we attune to the environment and to the other beings with it, our being naturally moves into energetic resonance with it. So we can kind of feel that here, can't we? When we're in this beautiful place, we like it because we move into energetic resonance with it. Or if we're around somebody who's really cranky and critical all the time, we don't like it because we move into energetic resonance. So we move into energetic resonance with it. But there's so much energy exchange that's going on in our organisms that evolution has created ways for us to kind of imagine that we're separate. To try to kind of limit some of that information. My information and yours. There's too much information to make the survival decisions that we have to make. And so we have to kind of limit it somehow. We have to, like Tim Wilson's snowball on the glacier. We have to kind of condense stuff into a little snowball, because otherwise it's just too much information and we're just resonating with, just way too much going on. So we develop a sense of this is what's true, this little snowball, and this is me and that's you, and we create in our development as human beings, from the time we're babies onwards, our brain develops ways of having a sense that we're actually separate from it all. And it's an evolutionary tactic, it's a survival tactic. Our brain has developed ways of maintaining stability. Everything's constantly changing. Everything's constantly changing. We see it in big ways, we see it in little ways. And we would never, again, it's just too much information. So our brain kind of says, okay, it's this. It's not changing, it's this. That our brain develops opinions about this and says, it's this. When in fact, it's not true. Niels Bohr, the great physicist, said if you're not confused by that, you're really not paying attention. Because everything is in constant movement. And so we're always trying to kind of we're trying to stabilize that movement. We're trying to kind of get a grip on things. And we're also, by evolution, programmed to approach opportunities and avoid threats to kind of keep this thing here surviving. So all three of those efforts actually keep us in this state of anxiety, kind of a constant anxiety, because we're constantly trying to limit what's going on. We're trying to kind of stabilize it, get it to sit still for a minute, will you please? We're trying to kind of keep away from things that are negative and approach things that are positive, that are good for us. And those are just sort of the biology, if you will, of this human organism. And we inherit the DNA of our ancestors who have learned how to do that because the other ones didn't survive. People who took in too much, or who couldn't make quick decisions, or who, approached threats and avoided goodness. Those are the ones that got eaten by tigers. And the Buddha, 2,600 years ago, and without the benefit of modern brain science, actually saw something very similar. And the way he divided the teaching into what he called aggregates, and he said there are 5 aggregates that make up this human thing here, and they come together in a process where, like a sheaf, what do you call it? A sheaf of wheat. When they put them in the field and they all lean against each other, or those corn stalks, where they all kind of lean against each other. Sheaf? What do you call it? Anyway, that these 5 aggregates, they come together and they kind of lean on each other, and they basically make up who we are as people. And the first aggregate is the fact that our senses, we have 6 senses actually, including the mind, which thinks, and there's this little sense organ, and the sense organ sees, I'll use vision, it has the capacity to take in information from out there, so there's an object, and there's this organ, and then the second aggregate is consciousness, and then so I'm conscious of the information coming in, and it hits my eye, and I go, so there's some information there. And the second layer of that is that the mind then says, it's this. There's perception. It's this. It's paper. It's watch. It's shawl. It's room. And we learn how to do that. We learn how to take these sense impressions, be conscious of them, name them, it's this, as we develop as human beings. And the brain develops that capacity from it starts to develop that capacity from the very beginning as little babies, where we hear, daddies talking to their kids and they say, that's a doggy, isn't that a, it's like, okay, that thing, doggy. And so we're teaching children's brains how to organize information in that way. And the Buddha saw that, just from watching his own experience, that we do that. So we have sense organs that take in information. There's consciousness that knows it. If we were dead, no. If we were in a coma, if we were unconscious, that the eye would still perhaps be working, but the information wouldn't be being processed if there was not the kind of consciousness that we have. So sense organs, objects, consciousness, perception. There's an interesting story that Oliver Sacks tells about a man who was actually born blind and had some kind of surgery that he was able, as an adult, to see again. And everyone was all excited because finally this man is going to have vision. And he was miserable because his brain hadn't learned, as he had developed, to process that information. And all he could see, he couldn't see things. He could see shapes and colors and movement, and it made him nauseous. It made him, just really sick to his stomach. He hated it. And finally he went blind again. I don't remember how. And he was so thankful, that he didn't have to be bothered by trying to see. Because his brain hadn't learned that capacity as it had developed. And then in addition to perception, it's this, we all know this next one, which is then the brain also says, and furthermore, and then the brain starts to tell stories about the this. So a doggy, now as an adult, I have a whole raft of stories about what doggies are like, and what prunes are like, and what, cars are like, and what bees are like, and so we have, something touches our sense organs, and the whole thing just kind of bursts into being, the perception and the stories, and we know how that happens. We can actually watch it. You're at a party, and somebody says, well, I just got back from Spain. And we can watch our own brains go, Spain, Spain. What do I know about Spain? And then sometimes at a party where you go a little nuts because people are kind of vying to tell their story about whatever it was, and what's happening is that the information, the word Spain, is coming in. It's really touching that glacier of information. And then it just, pops into being. That whole process just pops into being, where we've got perception and stories and narratives and emotions and all of that. And so that's the becoming. That's what's happening for us every moment. Every moment, every moment. It's happening right now as I'm speaking. Every moment. That's what the Buddha is talking about becoming and being born again into the world. But it's really the same sort of process that neuroscience is talking about. But that's not what I want to talk about. Because I wanted to name that, but then I wanted to really talk about coming back to why are we doing this? So why are we doing this mindfulness? Because what we're looking for and what we're looking at is the fact that this whole process of becoming is a process. That things actually move. There's energy, there's things, it's just everything's constantly changing. And that it's the mind that's grabbing it and holding it and pinning it down. And we have these habit patterns that we've practiced as long as we've been alive, for how to do that. Grabbing things, holding it, pinning it down in order to be stable, in order to be separate, and in order to have some sense of safety. Just part of the deal as a human being. But it's not real, the Buddha says, and neuroscience say. And so the reason that we suffer, the reason that we feel so anxious to begin with, is because we're trying to do something that's not doable. And the reason that we suffer is that we try so hard to do something that's not doable. So we're suffering because we're trying to kind of hold the river back, and it's hard work. So when we come into our practice, really what we're learning to do is to become a bit more fluid with the process of living. and a bit more at ease with letting go of that what the Buddha calls clinging, hanging on. And it takes a while because we're so conditioned to try to hang on. It's like trying to swim by hanging on to the side of the swimming pool. So the Buddha's teaching is that when we suffer, there is, by definition, something we are not understanding clearly. Something we are not knowing and accepting with wisdom and kindness. Something we're turning away from. So by definition, when we suffer, there is, by definition, something we don't understand and something we're turning away from. This is from Bhante Gunaratana. He says, in Vipassana meditation, we cultivate this special way of seeing life. We train ourselves to see reality exactly as it is, which is really quite different from what we usually do. We usually do not look into what is really there in front of us. We see life through a screen of thoughts and concepts, and we mistake those mental objects for reality. We get so caught up in this endless thought stream that reality flows by unnoticed. We spend our time engrossed in activity, caught up in an eternal pursuit of pleasure and gratification, and an eternal flight from pain and unpleasantness. We spend all of our energies trying to make ourselves feel better, trying to bury our fears. We are endlessly seeking security. Meanwhile, the world of real experience flows by unnoticed and untasted. In Vipassana meditation, we train ourselves to ignore the constant impulses to be more comfortable, and we dive into the reality instead. The ironic thing is that real peace comes only when you stop chasing it. When you just pause and see, it's like this now. There's a new movie out. I haven't seen it yet, but I was reading about it. It's called Time Out of Mind. It's an indie film in which Richard Gere roamed the streets of Lower Manhattan as a homeless man. They filmed it for 21 days, and he went virtually undetected. There were 2 people, I think on one of the last days, who recognized him. Didn't recognize what was happening, recognized him and thought, poor guy, he's really having a hard life. So he spent 21 days on the streets filming what it was like to be a homeless person. And he said that what was really interesting was that he could feel viscerally what it was like for people to turn away. You know, here is this person, and that this homeless person, and that he just would, you know, he could just feel it, that people would turn away. This is what he says. How New York was reacting to me on very little information, mostly visual information. I didn't go to any huge extremes physically with this guy, the guy he was portraying. He has kind of a shitty haircut and a couple days' growth of beard. The clothes were certainly not upper-class clothes, but it wasn't like you think this is a smelly, horrible guy. It wasn't like that, but even with those minimal cues, holding a plastic bag, I could see people from 2 blocks away make a decision. Whether they were conscious of it or not, they were like, I know that guy. And they filled in all the other things that one needs to know to have a reaction. They decided, okay, this guy is going to be asking me for money, and I don't really want to give him any money. In fact, I don't want to make any contact with him, but I feel guilty about that. Maybe he really needs something, but why should he make me feel guilty? So fuck him. Fuck him. Why should I give him money? As soon as I relaxed, this is Richard talking, as soon as I relaxed and got comfortable, I could see it. The very first time we did it is actually in the film. We were out in Astor Place, and that was the first test to see if this would even work with me out in the streets. I could see people go through these reactions, and it was so dissociative. It had nothing to do with me. It was all visual cues. And the context being so bizarre, it wouldn't occur to anyone, oh, that's Richard Gere, because the context is all wrong. We know things by context. So both the knowing things by context, how we don't pay attention, and also his experience of not being known. And that's what your experience is like. All those little homeless experiences that you're having internally, all those little experiences that have kind of 2 days beard growth and, swear and have scruffy clothes, That's what they're like. They're wandering around inside, just waiting for you to notice them. Maybe they're not what you think they are. So the invitation is to pay attention. The Dalai Lama says, all of our difficulties result from mistaken perception. Isn't that reassuring? All of our difficulties result from mistaken perception. U Pandita says, just noticing each thing, no comment, no hierarchy, no problem. With awareness, you don't have to be afraid of anything. Awareness can receive anything. We mostly are so focused on our reactions and our stories and what it means about me. How quickly does thinking come back to, what does it mean about me? There's a story I read a few years ago. A group of people, it was printed in Orion magazine, a group of people, the title was something like Gazing. It had more words in it than that, but I can't remember what they were. But it was an experiment in gazing, in looking. And it was a group of people who were heartbroken about an old growth forest that had been forested. And really felt the dukkha of the loss of that. And what they did was they decided to make a pilgrimage to basically bear witness, to instead of turning away, you know how we could turn away, again, the Buddhist teaching about concept and reflection and experience, we could conceptually write an article about what it is like to experience an old growth deforested forest. And they could have done that. Or they could have sat around and had focus groups and talked about how awful it was that this forest had been deforested. But what they decided to do was to drop into that third level and experience it. And to go to that place and bear witness. I want to read to you, it's a little bit long, but I want to read to you what Trevi Johnson says about her experience there. And she's talking now about just driving in. She says, almost immediately the forest itself ends, and a clear cut breaks over us like a tsunami. Down the mountains and up the mountains, unrelieved except by the road that cuts through it, lie the remains of a forest. Rounds of massive trunks supply the only focal point for our eyes, while a tangle of ripped branches and limbs fills every conceivable space between them. All the way to the horizons, the land has faded to gray. The place is not only dead, but mutilated. For several moments we stand there and allow ourselves to be hit over and over by the sight of it. When we get back in the car, shocked silence clatters behind us like a dragging muffler. She says the gaze is demanding. You can't just schedule a few minutes for it in the midst of a busy day. You have to settle in with the gaze. And so they went there to settle in and to spend some days in this place. The question was this: what would happen if we simply settled into this damaged place, observing the land and our own responses to it? Our intention was to get to know this place that we had heartily wished to run from. On the first morning, the bleak reality of the situation left room for no other reaction but sorrow. But gradually something else took over. You could call it fascination. Details of the place started emerging. The color of the bark, the pattern of the rings in the trunk I nested on. Almost immediately I heard a bird singing close by and was momentarily amazed that a bird could find something to sing about in such a place. Later I discovered that I could lie down on my tree stump and be supported from the top of my head down to my calves. I confess that at that moment I experienced what could only be described as glee. For each of us, the practice of gazing on the wounded forest evoked a consciousness of brokenness in our own personal lives. One woman was struck by how the land mirrored her own wasted youth, and the inescapability of the destruction all around enabled her to grieve for both the forest and her own past in a way that had never before seemed possible. She started making altars on the stumps, first for her own youth, then the forest, and eventually for those she thought of as the destroyers, the loggers, the consumers, the people she had previously been unable to forgive. Slowly we came to realize that our practice of purposefully seeking meaning and beauty in the wounded was teaching us important lessons about wholeness. We saw how life survived in this forest of stumps. We realized that the denizens of the place did not consider their habitat wounded. They merely coped and adapted. We understood on a visceral level that what is ugly, broken, and decaying is part of the whole. That truth granted us more acceptance of the broken, ugly, decaying aspects of ourselves. The clear cut also opened new reserves of compassion in each of us. When we first arrived, we regarded as villains the lumberjacks who had toppled these ancient and venerable trees. Before long, we realized that they, and even the corporations they worked for, were merely supplying all of us, members of the consumer culture, with the products we constantly demanded, from toilet paper to airline boarding passes to some critically acclaimed new book about climate change. We saw that we were all part of the problem and that we were all victims of a process much larger than ourselves. We discovered that what we had feared would be too hard to bear was not. Gradually, by practicing the art of gazing, we got to know the broken forest. And then, so slowly we hardly recognized what was happening, we began to love the place. Willingness to look turned into curiosity, which turned into acceptance, which turned into compassion, and that turned into love. By the end of the week, none of us wanted to leave. So the intention of our practice, gazing, looking to see what's deeply true here, what's happening in the fluid sense of happening, this kind of ongoing movement. What's happening? What's holding it back from happening? Seeing the suffering of are holding and trying to make things safe. Seeing all of what's here. Pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. Seeing it change from moment to moment. Seeing its compositional nature, which means seeing, the huge numbers of causes and conditions. You just think about us being here tonight. Hugh and Pat not being here tonight. Think about the infinite causes and conditions that contributed to this particular configuration of beings at this particular moment. We can't even, it's like the galaxies or something. It's just too much. We don't have control. It's like this now. It's out of our control. Hugh was reading, he's referred a couple times to the guest house, where he's invited us, welcome and entertain them all. These experiences that pass through. Cultivate the capacity to gaze, cultivate the capacity to be mindful. Much of the time, what we bump into when we practice is the place where we kind of tighten up and we say, I can't do this. Maybe that I could do. But I can't do this. There's a essay on my website, I can't do this, where when I was first dealing with my mother's dementia, it's like, I can't do this. It's too hard. There's a image in one of the Indiana Jones movies. Steven Spielberg and George Lucas relied when they were making the Star Wars movies and the Indiana Jones movies, they relied very heavily on classical mythology. Joseph Campbell consulted with them a great deal about some of the images, and they translated the images into a modern terminology. And one of the images in one of the movies that I really love is Indiana Jones has been searching for the Ark of the Covenant, this incredible treasure that's been lost for eons. And he finally has located it. He's finally located. He knows where it is. And he sneaks in and he opens the cover of the crypt where it's buried. And he throws his torch in. And you have to know, it's earlier, as you know, Indiana Jones, it's like the only thing, Indiana Jones is afraid of nothing, except snakes. It's the only thing in the whole world that he's like really afraid of. So he throws the torch in and it drops down to the bottom. And his sidekick looks in with him. He says, "Why does the floor move?" And Indiana says, "Give me your torch," and they throw the torch in. And Indiana, he kind of rolls over and he looks up at the sky and he says, "Snakes. Why does it have to be snakes?" And Salah, his sidekick, says, "You go first." But the thing is, that's an image from mythology. Because there are always snakes. Whatever my version of snakes are. It's part of our human predicament. It's part of our mythology. Whatever my version of snakes are, that's what is between me and the Ark of the Covenant. So when you sit and you go, why does it have to be snakes? Couldn't it be something besides this? No. that's the place. There are, if those of us who have traveled in Asia or in places where there are old temples, there often are these really kind of horrible monsters at the gates of the temples, and that's the message of those monsters. David White has a poem about the faces at Braga, where this temple, where you have to pass through, and the message to you is you have to pass through if you're going to get into the inner sanctum. And it's always snakes. And the Buddha invites us each to go first. In our own ways, in our own path. To learn, first of all, that it's like this. This is how it is now. To allow ourselves to let it be that. And from there to see what's true, what's needed. Remember, like the monkeys on the golf course, it isn't just to kind of see, oh, there's suffering here, but how do we resolve the suffering? How do we be with this in a way that releases suffering? But in order to do that, we have to pass through the gates. The perception, Ajahn Sucitto says, the perception that is most encouraged, anicca or impermanence, is that nothing is absolutely anything. Everything is moving and shifting depending on how we look at it. Nothing is absolutely so. Nothing is absolutely anything. So those perceptions, those stories, all those things that our minds do that try to kind of make things absolutely something. It's just stuff. It's just what the mind does. It's useful. It helps us find our own car. It's useful, it's helpful, but it's not real in some ultimate sense. Nothing is absolutely anything. So our practice is learning how to dance with that truth. Nothing is absolutely anything. The Buddha compared our perceptions to a mirage, that what we think we see it doesn't have substance really. It's just what the mind does. So we're not trying to create something. We're not trying to create a new and better self. We're not trying to fix ourselves. We're not trying to fix the world. We're cultivating the capacity to see little by little by little ever more clearly, with greater understanding, with greater kindness, to see with a wider and wider context, a wider and wider heart, a heart and a mind as big as the world, to see what is wholesome and healing, to see how to play in a world where monkeys move balls. How do we navigate this? How do we navigate these families of ours? How do we navigate these bodies of ours? How do we navigate, food that isn't ready on time, people who disappear when they're supposed to be here teaching? How do we navigate this? So to see ever more clearly how to be with it and be with the real experience of it. It's not pleasant, much of it. But to be with it in a way that doesn't really cause suffering and bring us to be caught in a dead end of suffering. There's a book called The Grace in Dying, and in the book she talks about that people often, not always, but often as they are dying, really come to that kind of spaciousness, that kind of luminosity. It certainly happened with my mother. It was one of the gifts of being present with her through that whole process, that I was able to, through her, it was like being with the Buddha, really, at the end. Through her transcendence, was able to really experience these amazing gifts of like, oh my gosh. The awareness is way bigger than any one person's dementia. It was just incredibly awesome to be with her in her in her luminosity. And indeed, I think the fact that she lost her conceptual mind enabled her to touch into it in a way that she might not have otherwise. So, yeah, I can be with this. This is pretty awesome. So we practice and we gain faith. We have these moments, we have these experiences. And we say, oh, I get it. I see how it works. And it really kind of gives us that kind of nourishment and support. And it's why we're here practicing and not just home reading a book about it. Because reading a book doesn't give us that experience. To know that we're safe no matter what. No matter what. This is Ajahn Chah. He says, do not try to become anything. Do not make yourself into anything. Do not be a meditator. Do not become enlightened. When you sit, let it be. When you walk, let it be. Grasp at nothing. Resist nothing. That's our practice. Easy to say, easy to read about, quite challenging when it comes to practice. And I'll close you with a quote from Stephen Levine, who, as you know, worked for many years. I think he's sort of retired now, but worked for many, many years working with people who were dying. And he said, the secret of healing is there's no secret at all. Healing is an open book. You are now on page 13. So enjoy page 13. Let's sit for a minute.